Hello, and welcome back to the BFA Baby podcast. As always, I'm your host, Taylor Hartman, and today is a really special episode. It's kind of a callback to something I did for fun in season 1, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to come back. If you don't know, aside from being a dancer and actress, I am also something of a writer. Last summer, I wrote a full-length novel entitled Her Skin, His Bones, and it follows a couple of dance majors at like a fictional university. And we're starting to come into summer as I'm filming this. It's about April 22nd, and I have a new writing project I want to open up with this summer, and I thought it would be fun to kind of revisit HSHB. I did a little audiobook reading in season 1 for an episode, and I thought it would be fun to continue, so I'm going to read you some chapters, and you can just kind of sit back and have a little story. A little bit of a reminder here, when we left off, last episode, last season, Dimitri and Sterling, our two main characters, were training for, or getting ready for their dance concert audition, and, we were talking about, they were training, cleaning up some tap steps, and, we kind of just met the characters. We met Sterling as this kind of workaholic, super ambitious girl. Dimitri's her best friend, all these fun things, and when we left off, they were auditioning for the fall dance concert at their university, Herman University. And yeah, so sit back. I thought I would cosplay as an audiobook narrator today. So sit back and enjoy the story. I hope you love it. Starting with chapter 3. "Did you see this rehearsal schedule?" Sterling gasped, sliding her phone across the library table. Dimitri looked up from his laptop, thankfully to finally be staring at something other than his theater history textbook. His eyes scanned Sterling's phone screen. Alexander had scheduled rehearsals for his piece 6 nights a week, all ending near midnight, most likely to avoid any crossover with his dancers' employment. Protocol for the fall dance concert was a minimum of 6 hours of rehearsal each week, which most choreographers would split up into 2 days a week, each rehearsal running about 3 hours. If they wanted to rehearse every day, or even for a few more hours each week, they would spread those rehearsals out and would be for shorter periods of time, ensuring the physical and emotional health of their dancers. Dimitri knew that Alexander, as department head, could do whatever he wanted. He also knew that Alexander demanded nothing of greatness out of his dancers. Therefore, if 18 hours a week of rehearsals was what he figured greatness would take, who was Dimitri to argue with him? Dimitri scoffed. The man's a fucking sadist. He passed Sterling's phone back to her. Sterling reached over the table and grabbed her phone, closing out her scheduling app. She pushed her textbook back in front of her. "Are you sure you're going to be able to handle all that?" Dimitri asked, looking knowingly over his eyelashes. Sterling rolled her eyes and turned her head back down to her textbook. "I'll be fine." "Fine." Dimitri leaned back against his chair, rocking the feet back, taking a balance on the 2 back legs. "I want you to be better than fine. I want you to be healthy and happy." Sterling chuckled, a slight roll of her eye. "Dimitri, come on now." "I'm serious, Sterling." Dimitri closed his textbook, raising his voice, making multiple other library patrons turn and look at the both of them. Sterling shot Dimitri a glare as Dimitri passed an apologetic look around the library. "I got it under control," she hissed through her teeth. Sterling dashed from the library study session straight to her first rehearsal for Alexander's piece. Regardless of Dimitri's lack of belief in her, Sterling was excited to take on the daunting rehearsal process ahead of her. She loved the thrill of running between rehearsals, pushing her body to the limit, pulling together a magnificent dance for the audience's come concert time. She stood in the center of the floor, going through her typical warm-up of jumping jacks, high knees, a series of crunches before easing into mobility work. As she warmed up, she smiled at her peers as they entered the studio, but they all knew better than try to persuade Sterling into their warm-up conversations. Sterling was widely known to be the dancer who needed her own space to warm up and cool down before and after rehearsals and shows. Most dancers are this particular when it comes to their warm-ups, some even going as far as being superstitious about the order with which they're done. "Dancers," Alexander shouted, entering the room with a loud clap of his hands. All of the students straightened their backs like soldiers coming to attention to the sergeant. All of their chins were lifted, ready to listen and learn. Welcome to your first rehearsal. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the piece, and we're going to immediately start setting it. I hope you're warm. Alexander spoke as he opened his laptop, not looking at any of the dancers. The dancers nodded along, and Sterling sucked in a deep breath, sending oxygen to her muscles. She rolled the kinks out of her neck and shoulders as she turned her attention to Alexander's laptop screen, which had been projected against a blank wall in the studio. The wall now displayed a PowerPoint presentation with a title slide covered in photographs of dark, brooding cathedrals. The only light source in the images was the moonlight cutting through the stained glass that had been tinted with dust and dirt over the years. Alexander would go on to explain that he would have the stage technicians recreate the effect of dirty stained glass using lighting techniques and projection. He wanted the audience to be able to feel the vastness of the cathedral space and the feeling that maybe the emptiness would go on forever. This piece was to be about the prevalence of domestic violence in religious spaces and the fear that victims have reporting their abusers. To the keen student, this would all be incredibly ironic, as Alexander's now ex-wife claimed domestic violence during their divorce trials, but according to the courts, there was never enough evidence found to support those claims. A few of the dancers exchanged inquisitive glances, knowing that the accusations that were thrown around during the divorce. They quickly turned their eyes back to Alexander's presentation as to not let them notice their silent conversation. For the following 10 minutes, Alexander rambled on about the inspiration behind the piece, flashing a few more pictures of weathered churches and cracked Catholic statues before turning off the projection and sending the dancers onto the floor. Sterling ushered herself to the center of the room, knowing that in a few moments, Alexander would place the dancers where he wanted them to start for the piece. She watched as Alexander flipped through the small leather-bound notebook, flipping it horizontally once he reached the desired page. Without raising his eyes, Alexander pointed his finger to the back left corner of the room and called the name of the dancer he wanted there. Eva, the back center. Archie, back right. Kylie. Eddie, front left. His finger jumped to the front right corner of the room. Max. Alexander finally lifted his head and made direct eye contact with Sterling, who had perfectly guessed her spot for the dance. And Sterling. Alexander smiled a smile that made her heart skip a beat. He never looked that happy to see her. In the center. His gaze lingered on her body for a few moments longer than what was comfortable. Once the tension in the room got thick enough to feel, Alexander snapped it with a clap of his hands and began setting the opening of the piece. Sterling entered her apartment and tossed her bags at the corner of her desk before going back to lock the door behind her. She knew what she had signed up for when getting cast in Alexander's piece, but she was shocked at just how taxing the very first rehearsal was. The first rehearsal left her with a smile as she pulled together an ice bath for her feet. She dumped the contents of her freezer's ice maker into a large bucket, her mind swirling with images of how the choreography she learned that night, how it would all come together, and how kind Alexander was to her, and of course, her solo moment to open the piece. She felt honored that Alexander would trust her with opening up his fall dance concert piece, as the audience's first impression is the only impression that really matters. If the dancers can't grip the audience's attention from the first second the lights go up, then the entire piece has essentially failed. Sterling gingerly walked over to the bucket, now full of ice and water, and brought it over to her desk. She placed the bath underneath her desk and sat down in the chair. After getting out her laptop and textbook to continue working on her theater history paper, she took a deep breath and plunged her bare feet into the freezing water. The initial shock of the freezing water made Sterling's breath catch in her chest, but after a few moments she was able to feel a wave of relaxation wash over her muscles. The cold water stung her feet until they ran numb, where they remained until she finished her assignments. The hours ticked away as Sterling worked, knocking out assignment after assignment, research papers and presentations. She was falling into her habit of working weeks ahead in one night. She didn't notice the time slipping away until she heard her alarm ringing the next morning. Her eyes snapped open, revealing a perfectly defined spiral on her cheek from falling asleep against her notebook. She was still at her desk, her feet still submerged in the bath of water that had long run room temperature. Sterling rubbed her eyes and looked around the room, grasping the fact that she had been studying all night. Chapter 4. Over the following weeks, Sterling and Dimitri's time together slowly began to trickle away. Dimitri, who had been cast in a contemporary dance piece choreographed by an alumnus of Herman University, had been rehearsing on nights that Sterling was working. If Sterling wasn't working, she was in rehearsal. If there was a night that neither of them were in rehearsal, Sterling was catching up on school and Dimitri was counting his calories. Alexander's piece had been set at a feverish pace, getting the almost 8-minute piece taught to the dancers in less than 3 weeks. This was obviously made in the design of the rehearsal schedule. With nearly nightly rehearsals, a lot of work could be done. At the 5th week mark for rehearsals, the university's fall break was scheduled, and begrudgingly, Alexander canceled the 3 rehearsals that he had set for the long weekend, as most of the dancers used this time to run off on miniature vacations to rinse the stress off the stress of the department. I should not quit my day job. Alexander canceled 3 rehearsals he had set for the long weekend, as most dancers used this time to run off on miniature vacations to rinse off the stress of the department. The long weekend stretched from Thursday to Monday, which meant that Sterling and Dimitri both finally had time where they could see each other outside of classes. Sterling had been missing their usual coffee dates and hangouts, but didn't have time to process how much she had missed them due to her intense workload. It wasn't until Dimitri showed up at her doorstep that her heart soared. Making the affordable choice to cook their own dinner at Sterling's apartment, Dimitri showed up with empty hands and an empty stomach. He didn't have the heart... Excuse me while I lose my spot. He didn't have the heart to tell Sterling that he ran an extra mile this morning to essentially burn off the calories for tonight's dinner before he had even consumed them. He knocked on the apartment door with a bright smile on his face, the excitement of seeing Sterling nearly overriding his anxious thoughts. Once inside, after tight hugs were exchanged, Sterling quickly got to cooking dinner. Dimitri helped out, chopping vegetables and spices for the tomato sauce that would be made. The pasta began to boil and the sauce started to thicken. Dimitri cleaned off the cutting board and got to work on the drinks. "How did rehearsal go this week?" Dimitri asked, looking over his shoulder as he pulled 2 wine glasses out of Sterling's cabinet. "It was weird," Sterling admitted, only briefly taking her eyes off the pasta sauce that she was stirring. "I got there, albeit late from work, so I went to apologize for it, and then Alexander told me to go home." Dimitri laughed, not believing what he was hearing. "What? He banished you from rehearsal? Was it because you were late?" Sterling heard the cork of a wine bottle pop as she turned the temperature on the stove up. "No, he was talking about how I'm doing too much this semester and could use a night off." Sterling's mind flashed to replay the events from 2 nights before. She'd been rushing into the studio from work, which was usually not a problem. However, she had to cover one of the late evening classes at the dance studio, as the usual teacher had fallen sick. The last-minute notification of this forced Sterling to take the class and just have to accept that she'd be late to rehearsals. Sterling was typically incredibly punctual. At the earliest, she'd arrive half an hour before rehearsals began to give herself a sufficient warm-up. However, that night she came flying in from the studio, hoping that the text she had sent to the cast group chat had made its way to Alexander would soften the blow. Group chat. Alexander's bitches. Sterling. "Rehearsal ran late at the studio tonight. Could someone tell Alexander that I'm hauling ass to campus and I'll be there ASAP. XX. Archie responds, "Sure, but I'm praying for you. He's been in one of his moods all day." Sterling didn't see Archie's text before she had already set her phone on Do Not Disturb and began driving. She was always one to drive safely, though tonight her foot leaned a little harder onto the gas pedal than usual. It felt like she was getting stuck behind the slowest driver in town, no matter which lane she was in or who she merged around. A hypothetical version of Alexander's reaction to her tardiness played through Sterling's mind as she bobbed and weaved through between slow-moving traffic and vehicles, trying to get back to campus as quickly and as safely as possible. Images of Alexander furiously scolding her in front of all of her peers flashed through her head, visions of him cutting her from the dance, or worse, holding her belatedness against her the next time it came to casting one of his pieces. Stopping at a red light, Sterling shook all of these thoughts out of her head. They were making her heart begin to race, and she couldn't afford to be towing the line of a panic attack while already running into rehearsal late. After what felt like the longest trip she'd ever driven, Sterling squealed into a parking space, cut her car's ignition off, and started running towards the studio. She didn't look behind her to check if she had locked her car doors. She just hoped that the habit of doing so had become second nature, and that her brain didn't even have to register it was done. She figured that she would ensure all her doors were locked after rehearsal. As she entered the building, she could hear music playing from the studio just as her feet carried her up both flights of stairs between the entrance of the building and the studio rehearsal was taking place in. The music had just stopped, and as she was turning the corner, she heard Alexander's booming voice cut through the silent rehearsal space. "Everybody, take 10. Sterling exhaled some form of relief as she could explain herself and her tardiness to Alexander while the rest of her peers were taking their 10-minute break. Sterling prepared herself in what she was going to say. Remember to profusely apologize, swear it'll never happen again, state that you're already warm from teaching, and that her thoughts were interrupted. "Sterling Gallagher, just the girl I wanted to see tonight." Alexander spun around from the stereo that he was playing the music from. "Sir, I am so sorry that I'm late." Sterling immediately started bubbling over with apologies. "I got caught up and work, I had to stay late, and I had to drive from across town," and her rambling was also immediately cut off. "Sterling, I'm not mad," Alexander explained. Sterling thought for sure that Alexander Mooney was fucking with her. He was always mad. "You're not?" The director's usually tough demeanor softened. "Not at all. Archie told me you got stuck at work. Are you still working the same jobs you were last semester?" Sterling nodded. Alexander was not only the head director of the dance department, but he was assigned to be her academic advisor way back when she committed to the university during the summer before her freshman year started. Throughout their biannual, occasionally triannual advising meetings, Sterling had slowly opened up to Alexander. She was known for taking large quantities of credit hours at a time, wearing herself thin in hopes that she could graduate a semester or even a year early. That would give her less time to get herself deeper into debt. When Alexander became quizzical on the amount of hours she was begging him to sign off on, Sterling explained the situation with her parents' lack of support, the multiple jobs she had to work to afford her education, and how badly she wanted success in this program and the greater dance industry despite it all. Alexander shook his head with a small sigh. "I need you to go home and get some rest tonight." Sterling's eyebrows furrowed together. "But what about this rehearsal? We still have the end section to learn and clean, and it wouldn't be fair to the other dancers if I was gone." "Sterling, I'm not asking, I'm telling. Go home, get some rest tonight. You know all the choreography. We're just cleaning tonight, you'll be fine." "Sir, I don't understand. Everything about this still felt like a trick." Alexander gently gripped Sterling's chin between his thumb and index finger, slowly caressing the dip of her chin with his thumb as he spoke. "I was in your place at one point, working multiple jobs, trying to get myself through school. It isn't easy, and I know for a fact how heavy of a course load you have this semester. I did sign off on it after all. Go home and get some rest tonight." Sterling's eyes dropped to the floor. She nodded, accepting defeat in this battle. She couldn't win an argument against Alexander after all. She wouldn't even dream of it. "Yes, sir." Alexander dropped his hands from Sterling's chin. "Thank you." He watched her turn her back and collect her belongings. At this point, the dancers began to shuffle back in from their break. "Sterling," Alexander asked across the studio, "you'll be at the donor gala on Saturday night, right? Dimitri and a few others will also be there." "Yes, sir, I will be." Sterling smiled softly. "Wonderful. Go rest up tonight." "Well, he's not wrong," Dimitri muttered, hoisting himself up onto the countertop. He set Sterling's glass of wine right beside where she was cooking. Sterling laughed, rolling her eyes. "Still, I think it's unfair to the cast. I don't know how he got that idea into his head." She balanced her spoon against the rim of the saucepot just long enough to take a sip of her wine. "Well, did you go home and rest?" Dimitri asked, jumping off the counter at the sound of a kitchen timer going off. He got right to draining the freshly al dente pasta. Sterling set her glass down and continued nursing the pasta sauce. "Yeah, and it was really nice. I was in bed by like 10 p.m. Dimitri smiled, knowing that Sterling really needed that night in. "Well, that's good, love. Pasta's ready whenever you are." Sterling turned back to see Dimitri stirring a pat of butter into the finished pasta. "Sauce is ready, just needs a quality control taste," she giggled. "I'll try it." Dimitri almost jumped in excitement across the kitchen. Sterling gnawed at the inside of her cheek. "Are you sure? I know things have been rough recently, especially with fall dance. I don't want you to hurt yourself." "I'm sure." Dimitri smiled, letting out a breath. "Lay it on me." Sterling laughed, putting a small taste of pasta sauce on her spoon before passing it over to Dimitri. Dimitri's ever-cinematic mind took the image of his best friend before him and played it back like a movie scene. If this was a movie, they'd be in love, making her apartment into their home. She'd offer him a taste of the pasta sauce, and he'd chase it with wine instead of guilt. Dimitri imagined Sterling placing her fingers lovingly around his chin, acting silly and feeding him the sample of sauce as the room filled with laughter. But this wasn't a movie. Dimitri took the spoon from Sterling's hand and tasted the sauce. He reminded him that Sterling had only seasoned it with oregano, salt, and pepper, and none of those spices tasted distinctly like shame. A small smile crept onto his lips once he swallowed. "Is it good?" Sterling asked, eyes wide if she was being judged on a cooking competition show. Dimitri nodded. "It's awesome." He said as he was unsure if he was speaking of the taste of the sauce or the fact that his heart didn't beat out of his chest at this unplanned taste test. "Perfect." Sterling cut the heat on the stove and carried the pot across the kitchen, setting it up by the pasta for her and Dimitri to serve up. After both friends got their plates made, they met on Sterling's sofa, bodies angled towards each other. "Alexander also asked me if I was going to be at the donor gala tomorrow night," Sterling added, twisting a few strands of pasta on her fork and taking a bite. "He said you'd be there." Dimitri nodded, holding his hand in front of his mouth as he chewed. "I'll be there. I'm dreading it, but maybe it'll be fun." Events like the donor gala were what Dimitri's nightmares were made of. Not only did he think he was bad at schmoozing and elbow rubbing that these kinds of events were made for, but they were also almost stocked to the ceiling with fancy appetizers and entrees that he had to choke down in hopes of not seeming disrespectful. Dimitri had successfully avoided last year's gala as he was terribly sick the night it was held, but he was required to go this year as he was this year's recipient of the Jonathan Rothschild Success in the Arts Scholarship, and the entire Rothschild family would be in attendance. "I'm not required to go this year, but I was already planning to," Sterling explained. "I'm always in need of an excuse to wear the red dress I got last summer." Dimitri smiled. The first time he saw the red dress on Sterling, it was over a FaceTime call, and he had to scoop his jaw up off the floor. She called him for a final opinion as she played jump rope with the decision of whether or not to purchase the dress. "Get it right now. Oh my fucking god, Sterling, if you don't get that dress, I'll never forgive you. You look fucking spectacular." "No way," Dimitri laughed. "I was going to wear my red suit pants and sport coat." Dimitri nearly choked on her bite of pasta as she laughed. "Come over tomorrow and we can get ready together. It'll be like going to prom." "Deal." Sterling turned her body to better face the television screen as she reached to her side and grabbed the remote. "What movie are you feeling tonight?" Dimitri turned his eyes up to the screen, watching Sterling pull up Netflix. "Definitely something funny." "Right on. Is Mean Girls still on here?" "I think so." The room fell to a comfortable silence, with only the occasional sound of the remote button clicking. Dimitri took another bite of pasta, watching Sterling search Netflix for the movie. He looked down at his plate to twirl another bite of pasta, but then realized the plate was empty, and he didn't feel a thing. Okay, well, those were the next 2 chapters. I think I like this 2 chapter at a time energy. It's like a 20-minute little sprint of an episode, and I hope you guys liked this little kind of audiobook type episode. And if you want me to do like an in-depth conversation on how I wrote the entire book, similarly to how I did the episode about how I choreographed and directed my dance film, I'm totally open to doing that too. I have a lot of fun little writer tips and tricks that I think would make the episode really fun and interesting. But I hope you kind of liked the change of pace. I liked playing audiobook narrator, even though I'm still not great at it. But a little taste of my book. I haven't really done a lot of thinking on it recently, so it's been fun to kind of come back and visit and kind of hop back into the world of that story that I spent so much time on last summer. So I'm really, really excited to feel that out. Well, thank you so much for listening. And if you want to follow the journey, you can follow the podcast at BFA Baby Podcast or me at Tata's Ballet on Instagram. I will see you all in the next episode. Married and a kiss. Mwah.